Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going Weekly Games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube, as well as the Basement Radio Arcade podcast. Back with another episode of Talking About Games. This is my solo cast where I try and deep dive into some of the financial, technical, and historical details behind some of the news stories that we see going around in the news cycle. So on most of the other shows, we don't have enough time to really get into a lot of the details. So I kind of wanted to do this show as a step aside to kind of dive into some of those things that we don't get a chance to go into on some of the other podcasts. So I apologize about being so late tonight. One of the problems is I really wanted to use tonight to try and broadcast from the mini PC that I have. So I have a mini PC that runs off of an AMD APU that's like a Ryzen 6900H. I knew that there was going to be a risk of a little bit of a problem because I'm trying out a new 4K webcam, as well as trying to hook up a teleprompter that I just got in from Elgato. And so the camera actually worked fine. It was the teleprompter that I was having problems with. It wasn't getting enough power from the USB array hub. It wasn't a hub, just off of the backplane of the PC. So I had to shift everything over to an entirely different PC that I hadn't broadcasted from for a long time, do a lot of setup. So we're getting started a good deal late tonight. So without much further ado, I'm going to try and get into it. This is going to be a little wonky because, like I said, we're running off an entirely different setup. So with some new equipment. So let me try and bring everything up here. First story in the rundown, and I apologize, the overlay, the way this overlay is set up, the news stories aren't quite coming up in the feed as visible as they normally would, but we'll just go ahead and run with it. First story they have in the rundown: Sony's new PlayStation Passkey support means you can happily forget that password one last time. So this story over on Tweaktown. I'm not actually sure who the author was. Oh, Oliver Haslam. So the news article starts out, we've all been in that situation where we need to sign into the PlayStation website, or if we're lucky, a new console, and find that we just can't quite remember our PlayStation Network passwords. Yes, we should probably have used a password manager and know the password that we set shouldn't be the same one we use elsewhere, but thankfully, these days are coming to an end. So I just kind of wanted to get into some of the details on this. So I wanted to bring this up because this is a new security implementation for your PlayStation account. As Oliver mentioned, it's really kind of a pain in the butt, particularly with these new generation consoles where you have to sign in. If you don't have something like this, the Xbox kind of requires you to basically go through your phone to do your initial setup, which is actually okay, except there's no kind of native way around that. So I found that a little bothersome when I first set up my Xbox, if you don't want to be bothered with signing up via phone. But by the same token, if you do try and sign in on the console, then depending on how complex your passwords are, I know my passwords are like 16 characters, upper lowercase numerals, special characters, things like that. This could be really tedious and cumbersome. The type of sign-in that I tend to like these days with these types of devices is where you have a QR code where you can hold up your phone, capture with your camera. It gives you a URL, sends you to a site. You can log in there and enter your credentials on your phone because I have some more, secure tools that allow me to have all of my passwords on my phone there. But what we're starting to see these days is a lot more additional methods like this that allow you to authenticate via a device that you have, and so that makes it a little bit easier. And so, as the article kind of mentions, it allows PlayStation Network users to migrate to a two-factor authentication method that offloads the authorization and access activity to a device that uses biometrics. So what this will do is it allows you to authorize in a more secure manner using two things that you have, your phone and your unique biometric signature. So I said two-factor authentication is really more multi-factor authentication. If you're not familiar with the principles of two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, the parameters behind that, the foundational principles behind that are that in order to authenticate to be given access to a secure resource that should normally require best practices is that it requires the person to provide something that they have combined with something that you know. So for example, if you have, say, a secure fob, like a YubiKey, you typically you have a password that you associate with that, and the fob has to be inserted right in a USB key in a USB port, or some other manner into the device, and so that way it reduces the chance that your account on that device via that device could be compromised through theft or some other means of gathering intelligence on you. The passkey concept, which is similar to the vault concept that's used by privileged access tools like CyberArk, is even more secure because it knows and has your password, and you don't even know what your password is. So if you use something like Bitwarden, you don't even have to know what your password is. You can use that service to actually generate the password for you. I use Bitwarden, and for many of my accounts, I don't even personally have any idea what my password is. I can find that out. I can go into the service and go in and look at it, but you don't have to, and you don't know it. CyberArk and some other implementations, as well as this one, in most cases, you won't even know what your password is. And in fact, CyberArk actually goes in and will, depending on how you have it set up and configured, can actually cycle users' passwords. So again, they don't know what it is. They don't know when it changes. And so that way, even in the event of physical compromise, in case somebody's stealing your phone or you being held hostage or at gunpoint or whatever, you still can't necessarily cause a compromise to that device because, again, you don't actually know what your password is yourself. So what this does is it helps alleviate, so take all that away, a lot of that's enterprise stuff. But in this case, for the PlayStation implementation and for other consumer electronics, it's really a matter of just alleviating the pain in the butt that it is having to use the virtual keyboard to sign into a resource. Again, as I mentioned, my passwords are 16 characters long with caps, lowercase symbols, and numbers. Signing into an account can be a nightmare. And if you don't have QR codes, and even sometimes, depending on your camera and your operating system, sometimes you run into problems where QR codes don't always work. Or you need a certain application that doesn't just natively work with your onboard Android camera application. Sometimes I run into that. And sometimes, depending on the implementation, like for a lot of video streaming services, sometimes they want your phone and the device you're trying to log on to be on the same Wi-Fi network. Again, depending on exactly what the security implementation is. And then sometimes, when I try and sign into like my Disney account or something like that, those devices don't discover each other on the network, because even though everything homes down to my base station network, I have different Wi-Fi networks set up around the house and things of that nature. So sometimes, like I said, it's just a real administrative nightmare. So this is great that, it's going to become an improvement on kind of quality of life stuff, administrivia that, PlayStation users have to go through. Xbox also, Xbox I don't think has a passkey implementation. Maybe they do. The main convenience that they have is that you can sign into your Xbox using a PIN. So you can use I think a 4 or 6 digit code to do your sign in there. I'm not entirely sure if it uses the same PIN for your Xbox and your Microsoft logins. My accounts are tied together. So when I log into Windows, I just use my access code. I would hope that the Xbox implementation does the same thing. And I'm also not absolutely certain if you use that for the first time, sign into a new Xbox, or if it makes you go through password or some other authentication means. Nintendo also offers passkey, although I've never personally used that one myself either. One thing to note is that typically a passkey is assigned to a device, not to an account. So if you have multiple devices, you can't always access it from a different device. I know for some things, my authenticator is on a particular phone. It's on my Google 6 Pro, and so, which I don't carry all the time, because it's kind of like my backup phone in a lot of cases. I carry it sometimes, but not very frequently. And so I can't, for accounts that use that as the authentication mechanism, I can't sign into those accounts unless I have that phone. So a lot of times that means I have to go into a drawer, bring the phone out, start it up. It sometimes needs to get a bunch of updates, blah, 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 blah. So at any rate, that's not a typical use case necessarily for a lot of people. Most people don't have multiple phones, but you do have a lot of people who have separate lines, sometimes because they have a BYOB phone for work. We're getting around to where a lot of enterprises have, you can bring your BYOB phone and they can have some type of security partition so that there's a part of the phone that's kind of your work phone, but the rest of the phone is like your personal phone. But even when you have that, people definitely upgrade, and we are now getting into a world where sometimes people will upgrade every year. And so if you do that, or if you're that type of person, one thing you have to remember is that you need to disable on the old device your authenticator or whatever kind of security means you have for authentication on that device to other accounts. And preferably migrate that to the new phone. A couple of times I've not done that. I think Battle.net is now getting away from use of the authenticator on your phone. But on a couple of occasions, I hadn't disabled and migrated it from my old phone, and it was a total pain in the behind having to go to Battle.net customer support and get that taken care of. The easiest thing to do in that case is just to go and disable two-factor, multi-factor authentication temporarily, then just put it as a new setup on the new phone and don't worry about migration. But again, if you do have it tied to a phone, and especially in this instance where it's tied to the phone and then tied to a biometric through the phone, again, that's probably going to be a super pain in the behind if you forget to migrate off of the old device. So hopefully people find that information helpful. We'll move on to the next story. I'm going to grab a drink really quick, so just give me a second. So next story in the rundown is Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League fails to meet Warner Brothers expectations. This story over on... That's a good point. I don't know. Over on Eurogamer, sorry, by Victoria Kennedy. And I quote, the story starts, the Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League has failed to meet publisher Warner Brothers expectations. During a financial call, Warner Brothers Discovery's chief financial officer, Gunnar Wiedenfels, said Rocksteady's recent release had fallen short of our expectations. The executive did not share any sales figures for Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League during the call, but admitted it had left the company with a tough year ahead when it comes to a year-on-year comparisons. Last year, Warner Brothers published Mortal Kombat 1 and Hogwarts Legacy, the latter of which became the best-selling game in the U.S. in 2023. So a couple other details about this. Let's see. Sorry, delays and leaks were not really this game's friend. So there were a couple of delays associated with the game that kind of gave a lot of gamers a negative feeling about the game before it even launched. There were also leaks around the game. Really, when this game launched, it was already more infamous than known, or anticipation was really built up for its gameplay or story. It had a buggy launch and numerous server problems, which caused Rocksteady to credit early players with in-game currency as compensation. Overall, again, just generally not a good look. Then there was a patch that for many players increased their instability in the instances of bugs that were reported and experienced. A reminder that this game, unlike 2022's Gotham Knights, was supposed to be a game as a service. It was supposed to have a long-term revenue tail meant to drive operational cash flow. During the course of its development, I made numerous references of comparison to Square Enix's Avengers and how it would need to exercise that ghost, as it, along with the game's just general impression made in trailers and video spots, was giving consumers a lot of misgivings before this game dropped. So already fighting an uphill battle. That all being said, we need to balance everything we are hearing from Warner with the data point of the fact that the game charted on NPD in third place for the month of its launch. Also a reminder that that occurred after just 1 week of sales data, as NPD's January numbers were built off a 5-week recording cycle that dipped into the first few days of February, as the game did not launch until February 2nd. The game sits at a 60 on consoles on Metacritic and a 63 on PC, where it is available via Steam. It's actually enjoying a pretty positive critical take from the community there, and last time I checked, when I was scripting for this episode, it was at an 80% off of 4,218 reviews. Of course, part of the problem is that this game falls even shorter when bumped up against the comparison to last year's Hogwarts, as was mentioned at the beginning of that article over on Eurogamer. That title went on to be the best-selling game of the year. What seems to be clear from the performance of Gotham Knights, Hogwarts, and now Suicide Squad is that Warner Brothers Games' financial performance is much more so driven by the strength of its license and the pitch it is making to gamers than maybe the design of the game itself. I know that there are a lot of very, very, very staunch fans of Hogwarts. I still feel very much so, just from my observation of the conversation, that even given, that Hogwarts may have had, and I didn't personally play it, may have had good design, what I heard from a lot of people, and so again, this is my commentary about what I heard from players, not my own take on the game's design and gameplay, because like I said, I didn't play it, is that it was much more so a conversation about how people were enamored by being in the Harry Potter universe and being in the world, and a lot of the zeitgeist that comes with the association with that licensed IP. Then I heard a lot about people really enjoying the gameplay. And so in a lot of ways, in my own experience, for instance, Fire Emblem Three Houses, that game, I think it was a pretty good game. I wouldn't necessarily say it was great or perfect, but I know that my own uptake of it was associated much more so by the fact that a lot of the school grounds and kind of the setup and the premise for that was very closely associated with kind of my own upbringing in some of the schools that I went to. So just saying that there was a knock-on effect of that being a licensed IP. That was definitely, unquestionably the case with Gotham Knights, which, by all accounts, as far as I could see and tell, had problems with its uptake and traction that it took with the gaming consumer market. However, it went on to pretty strong sales, winding up at 17th overall in the U.S. For the year that it launched. And again, it was a game that launched late in the month of October of that year. Either way, Suicide Squad did not come off well in early marketing, the January preview, early access, or post-launch. In 2 weeks' time, the player count on Steam went from 13,500 to less than 1,000, showing pretty poor player retention and engagement. The interesting thing here is that Rocksteady has a 1-year roadmap with the first post-launch DLC built around the Joker. But it makes you wonder what the appetite is going to be to continue making investment in the Suicide Squad when the launch performance was so lackluster. Remember, this is Warner Brothers. Typically, a game's strongest performance is when it is at launch, and we have seen a precipitous drop-off from that in this game's launch window. Warner Brothers Interactive Entertainment, which is where Warner Brothers Game Studios sits in, is part of Warner Brothers Discovery, which has been notorious for cost-cutting since the merger finalized back in April of 2022. Since then, Warner Brothers Discovery has finalized the merger with $50 billion plus in debt, and they've been very aggressive in pursuing debt reduction. It ratcheted up its initial projection of debt of debt reduction from 3.5 billion to 4 billion. So that was their projection that they were going to reduce that $50 billion plus debt by 3.5 billion, and then projected that they were going to reduce it by 4 billion. And part of the way they got there was by canceling Batgirl, plans for the Wonder Twins, and shutting down the CNN Plus streaming service. So again, going scorched earth and stopping investment on things where they were going to hemorrhage additional cash, right, in an effort to strangle and staunch that debt. So it's highly likely that the plans for Suicide Squad, I think, in my opinion, will get canceled, with Warner Brothers revising guidance for the fiscal year, showing that as a cost savings. Although, admittedly, as far as that percentage of their total business, the impact might be fairly small, but they might be in a situation where they're just trying to grab every penny that they can from the couch cushion and save it. Since the merger, the company has made $33 billion and then $42 billion in annual revenue. So again, they're trying to make way, trying to make revenue. Very challenging environment, very competitive in video streaming services. They went to this merger to try and show that it would be beneficial to stakeholders. This is definitely a black mark that they don't want in the windshield as they're trying to get that message out to investors. So we will see how it goes. All right, we're going to move on to the next story here and give me just a second to get a little more to drink. Okay, next up in the rundown, Battlefield game director Marcus Leto leaves EA and Ridgeline Games. This story over on Eurogamer again, and maybe the last story I said mistakenly. I'm not absolutely certain. Yep, that is 2 stories sourced from Eurogamer, which usually I try and get around a few more websites, but this script has them both coming from Eurogamer. There's stories 2 and 3. So Battlefield game director Marcus Leto leaves EA and Ridgeline Games. Halo co-creator and Battlefield game director Marcus Leto has left EA. Leto, who had been heading up Seattle-based Ridgeline Games, an EA studio dedicated to the Battlefield franchise, has seemingly scrubbed all mentions of Battlefield in EA from their social media bio, as well as updated their LinkedIn to state they've now left EA. So, getting into the details of this. So, Ridgeline Games appears at this point to not have opened a requisition for Marcus's replacement yet. And in fact, at this point, neither company, neither EA nor Ridgeline, has made an official announcement. One thing to note is that this is the second major leadership departure at the studio in recent weeks, with co-founder and art director Chris Matthews having left last month to join 343 as their studio art director. Again, there's been no formal announcement from Ridgeline or EA, and for the hardcore dedicated Battlefield community, the shadow departure has caused some worry. The popular belief was that Leto was brought on to right the ship in the wake of the debacle that was the Battlefield 2042 launch. In September of 2022, Lars Gustafsson, the former creative director, left, and the next Battlefield campaign was given unto Leto at Ridgeline. And so Lars was, I believe, at DICE, where obviously the series is really head honchoed, but at least for the campaign content, they had handed that off to this new studio, and Leto and Matthews were the heads of that studio. Gustafsson at the time had been with the Battlefield franchise for 20 years. With that turnover having occurred in late 2022 and Leto and Matthews now leaving, that makes just under 17 months that the upcoming successor to Battlefield 2042 had been in Leto's hands. Again, at least the campaign content. Battlefield is one of those products that, very much like Call of Duty, you kind of have a number of studios working on it. Although I don't think it's quite the same setup where there's a consistent, deterministic set of, you've got it this year, work on it for, you work on it for 3 years. Okay, you're next in the hopper, right? I don't think that they're that regimented. But that's just my impression that I get from the news that I read. But at any rate, again, it makes it just under 17 months that the upcoming successor to Battlefield 2042 had been in Leto's hands. That is typically not enough time for a game to transition out of pre-production, early on development to full-scale production development with a full staffing ramp-up. So at this point, it's my belief that the campaign is in some kind of state where maybe there's enough kind of foundational code laid down to start really ramping up and bringing people on. But it's at a stage that I don't think is necessarily the greatest to be transitioning it with a lot of disruption and a lot of churn. With these key leadership changes, it'll be interesting to see how Vince Zampella, who is the head of Respawn Studios, but has also been given the Battlefield franchise and pretty much all of EA's kind of first-person shooter properties, including Apex Legends. It'll be interesting to see how he responds. He may assert more of a strong hand and direct oversight of the work Ridgeline was doing, although that doesn't really seem to be his style. But again, he may not have a lot of choice at this point, given that I feel like it's in a fairly fragile point in the development lifecycle to be handing it over, particularly if you don't want to incur a significant delay. Maybe there's somebody there who's waiting in the wings, and you'll be able to fleet them up from a local succession plan, or somebody could be brought in from DICE or another EA studio. But again, it's going to be very interesting just to see how this is handled. The new iteration of Battlefield that Leto and his team were working on was supposed to use an upgraded version of the Frostbite 3 engine, which debuted in 2013. So I think it's also kind of, from a technical strategy perspective, pretty important to get this game out as a significant consumption use case of the Frostbite of that Frostbite 3 engine upgrade, so that you can gather lessons learned and have other people who can then leverage off of that institutional knowledge for their further on development as more and more studios are leaning on Frostbite. I know that I've seen in a lot of the news cycles kind of indications that there are mods and additional tools. One of the shortcomings of Frostbite had been a lot of complaints, and it resulted in a strong voice track that kind of ran around the gaming community that Frostbite was bad, when it was really a matter of Frostbite just didn't have the tools built around it for direct application to a lot of the genres that they were trying to leverage it for. And so in contrast to something like Unreal, which has a ton of assets because of its widespread use and a marketplace that is pretty robust and pretty mature, so that if there's something you don't have, you could typically go and find that, or you can find somebody that has experience in building something like that. Frostbite, in the inception where they were trying to roll it out across the company, really hadn't been used for anything but a competitive multiplayer PvP first-person shooter. And so when you try and take that and you try and apply it to a racing game like Need for Speed, or you try and apply it to a football game, a lot of the assets and models and wireframes and other things like that that you need haven't really been built around it as a tool. All right, so we'll go on to the next story. Give me just 1 second to switch it over. So this probably undoubtedly is the disappointing news that went around today that unfortunately I have to deal with as many other content creators and podcasters and journalists, I'm sure, had heartstrings attached to this topic. This story over on VG 24/7. PlayStation now announces plans to lay off 900 people, including the entire closure of the London studio. Insomniac Games, Naughty Dog, and Guerrilla Games will also see reductions in their workforces. This story posted by Mark Warren, senior staff writer over at VG 24/7. PlayStation has announced plans to lay off 900 people from its global workforce as part of a reduction of the company's overall headcount by 8%. Several PlayStation-owned studios, including Insomniac Games, Naughty Dog, and Guerrilla Games, will be affected, with PlayStation Studios London studio set to be closed entirely. Obviously, we have had a ton of layoffs going around the industry. Last year was an all-time high of, I want to say it closed out at about close to 10,000 layoffs around the gaming industry, I think in total, in kind of the September-October timeframe. I know it was at 6,500, 6,800. Already at the beginning of the year, we have hit, I can't remember exactly what the figure was, but we have hit a significant percentage already of what we saw last year, and it's only been the first 2 months of the year. There's different theories and different thoughts that are out there. I know a lot of people have some very staunch beliefs in what's going on. I know some of my mutuals are seeing data that indicates that Sony wasn't overstaffed. I haven't pulled those threads myself, so I can't really necessarily speak to them. But by and large, what we do know, regardless of its particular dynamic at one particular company, is that overall in tech and as well in game development, the pandemic had the effect of a very large spike in consumption and revenue as people were in locked rooms, and a lot more people were playing a lot more games than had historically been seen as the norm. And that companies and corporations tried to rush to capitalize on that. And many of them incorrectly predicted that that was going to maintain, that was the new normal, that sales would continue to be that high. And so they didn't really proactively take action to level out workforces or to really lean themselves to the way the world was going to be after the pandemic, and they unfortunately have been starting to take that action since they saw see margins and revenues declining, and of course revenues have been continuing to go up, but I think the real story here is how margins have been getting more problematic. At the end of the day, none of that really excuses any of the decisions that were made. I think I covered this in either talking about games or another podcast somewhere. But at the end of the day, executives are looking at data and they're making decisions and making bets, and they are turning out to be the wrong ones. And not every corporation is Nintendo. We maybe unfortunately have a business culture in the West that accepts and assumes that layoffs are just part of the natural business cycle and they are going to happen. And so those are the choices that people make. In the case of the Immortals of Avernum, a story that went around a few weeks ago, that the development staff at Ascendant Studios indicated that even if their senior leadership had taken a pay cut, it wouldn't have really compensated for the fact that that game didn't sell well. And so, you have multiple scenarios going on around the industry. Obviously, this is not the case at Sony, but you have studios in a very challenging environment. I think, as I mentioned, either on this show or some other show, that the metrics of the industry are that out of every single software development project that gets started at all in the gaming industry, only about 5% of them make it. I'm trying to remember exactly what the numbers are now, but I think only 20% of them. Now I'm gonna have to go back and find these numbers again. It's 20% and 5%, and I can't remember exactly which fork those are out of. But I think only 20% make it to retail shelves, digital storefronts, and out of those, only 5% turn out to be profitable. That metric may be swapped, but at any rate, it's an incredibly challenging, risk-prone industry. There's not a lot of tolerance for failure, right? In terms of what I mean by that is percentages of games that make it through. And so these are the decisions that are being selected by the company. Xbox just laid off 1,900 developers, 10,000 people overall. Similar measures were taken last year by a lot of companies. If I'm not mistaken, and I could be, but if I'm not mistaken, this is the, I think, second layoff that PlayStation Studios has done, or that Sony has done, that has impacted PlayStation Studios. I think some people were laid off at Bungie as well near the tail end of last year. And so, like I said, with the exception of Nintendo, almost every large major corporation, Activision, EA, I'll have to check around at some of the other ones like 2K and Ubisoft. I'm pretty sure layoffs happened at Ubisoft as well. But every major large third-party publisher and platform owner, like I said, with the exception of Nintendo, has had some level of layoff. And so it's incredibly unfortunate. It's probably not the last iteration that we're going to see at my a technical corporation where I spent a bulk of my kind of midpoint of my career. I went through 5 layoffs. So typically, when they come through, they're not just once. Typically, when it happens the first time, you would be well served to assume that that will not be the last one that you're going to see. So, my hope is that those people all find places to land. We do have things going on like Arrowhead Studios enjoying a lot of success with Helldivers 2 and actively in the mode of hiring and bringing on additional staff. Same thing for Pocket Pair with Palworld. So I'm hoping that as we go throughout the year, we continue to see some successes and people like that are able to find places to wind up. Next story I want to go over is, unfortunately, Life is Strange is also cutting people, which is really unfortunate because this is, Life is Strange is definitely kind of one of those art house style games that's very much beloved by a lot of the gaming community that's played it. And so it's unfortunate that we're having to see this. Life is Strange Studio cuts 20% of staff. Life is Strange True Colors developer Deck9 Games announced that it would be laying off staff. The studio mentioned the games industry's worsening market conditions as a reason for the cuts. Today, we made the difficult decision to lay off 20% of our staff. These people are amazing, talented, awesome developers, Deck9 said on Twitter. They've made a huge impact during their time at Deck9 Games. We did not take this decision lightly. So I'm trying to scroll through here. This isn't one of the articles that I prepped way ahead of time, but a lot of these developers kind of will mention some particular financials or dynamics in the industry. Games industry has been ravaged with layoffs just this week until dawn, and the Quarry developer Supermassive Games announced that it would be laying off 90 of its employees. And just this morning, like I just mentioned, Sony laid off 900. In the case of Sony, we can definitely see the causality. We see game budgets, AAA game budgets, increasing by a significant amount. One of the things that kind of doesn't get mentioned often in the gaming community voice track, there's this ongoing rhetoric of, record revenues, record profits. We haven't necessarily really seen record profits necessarily in various earning reports. That's a very hyper detailed comment that you really have to dig into account balance sheets and earning statements to really suss out. Every gaming company has not been enjoying record profits. Definitely record revenue, but again, when you talk about record revenue, what you really have to look at is, what are the cost of goods sold, how many sales are made, and then how many sales, how many dollars in sales do you have to generate to equate to X percent of profit, right? And in a lot of these industries, the case will sometimes be that you have to sell an incredible amount to generate a very small amount of profit. And so when the optics are like that, the financial health of the company, the financial health of the business model, and the business venture is not the upside that we often talk about and often see, which again is just something that you don't necessarily understand unless you really dig into those details. So there's probably a little more detail on that. I'm gonna swing back and talk about that because one of my mutuals on Twitter asked me to elaborate on a given topic. So let me just go on to the next story. This is actually kind of a good news story. Skull and Bones breaks records at Ubisoft despite reportedly low player numbers. So this story over on GameSpot News. People are spending 4 or more hours in the game every day on average, the second highest mark in Ubisoft's 37-year history. And so I quote, let me give the writer credit here, Eddie McCooch over at GameSpot News. Ubisoft's pirate game, Skull and Bones, and I really don't like the descriptive term pirate game because it's really not a pirate game. I think that's been part of the thing that has led to a lot of misconceptions and misunderstanding of what this game really is. I would equate this game much more so to kind of a World of Warships kind of game, but set in kind of an RPG type of layout instead of the kind of arena MOBA-like, iterative, mission to mission, fight to fight type of setup that is World of Warships. But at the end of the day, it's still very much that. It's, I've heard it equated to kind of a car PG, like you have in Forza Horizon. And I would kind of say that probably sticks, but I would maybe move it more so to less of a Forza Horizon and more of like a Forza Motorsport. And maybe even, I would more of a vehicle simulation where, maybe American Truck Simulator too, where it's not the game isn't oriented around you buying like a bajillion cars and having a garage full of more cars than you could ever possibly drive and making enough money to upgrade every single one of those cars and deck them out, with custom paint jobs and everything. It's much more so, you as the ship, getting cosmetics and doing things with that one particular ship. I don't think the game, and yet I haven't played it, but my impression is from what I've heard, I don't think the game is heavily oriented around you kind of building up a fleet and being worried about like multiple ships and how they're decked out. It's pretty much, your one ship that you're focused on and kind of grooming it. And the experience of owning it and leveling it up. So at any rate, Ubisoft's private game, Skull and Bones, is not putting up the strongest player numbers, but the publisher is touting the game's record player engagement as the title's first season launches. According to Ubisoft, Skull and Bones players are spending on average more than 4 hours in the game every day. This is the second highest daily playtime average for an Ubisoft game since the company was founded 37 years ago. Ubisoft did not say what the number one title is, or was, or is. So, obviously, Skull and Bones has had a kind of torrid news cycle around its, multiple reboots, multiple reimaginings of what it was, multiple visionary frameworks that it went through. Normally, when we hear that, and I mean hear that beyond just the development hell type of story. So we hear a lot about games kind of being rebooted and starting over and getting de-scoped and cutting fat and yada yada yada. And those things to me are kind of normal. What I think is exacerbated here and where it kind of sets off a lot of warning bells was, the things that we heard about just the game like being reimagined in terms of what it was. Like first it was a pirate game, and then there was more emphasis on RPGs, and it went back and forth with more emphasis on combat, and then you were getting off your ship and you weren't getting off your ship, and that type of core level churn that's oriented much more so around the architectural ethos and kind of the creative ethos behind the game. That to me sounds a lot more like Anthem. And so when I hear things like that, then I do worry that a game isn't going to stick the landing. However, what I will also say is one of the problems that there were with the news cycle around this game is that it was just heavily misreported from the very beginning. From the very beginning, people came away with it and said, I don't know what that game is, or articulated what the game was, and I'm like, that's not what the game is. And so there were also points through the cycle where the team had done a good job of conveying, at least at the time, what the game was, and the mainstream gaming media was still misinterpreting it and misreporting it. In many cases, because the people reporting on it were just not the people. Those people hadn't played World of Warships. They didn't play Dreadnought. They didn't play ships oriented. They weren't World of Tanks players. They weren't people oriented around the notion of capital ship games. They didn't experience that weird kind of intermix that games in that subgenre are, where they are a kind of weird kludge between strategy and tactics. It's a world where you make decisions kind of early on, and sometimes they don't play out until 10 or 15 minutes later in the match, but they're still very tactically impactful. It's not a minute-to-minute game in a lot of ways, playing a game that heavily involves capital ship combat, and we've seen like Star Trek iterations like this. There are kind of some 4X games that kind of delve a little bit tangentially into this, but at the end of the day, it's really a matter of, it really sits at a weird place somewhere between kind of a real-time, minute-to-minute, second-to-second type of multiplayer arena type of combat, but almost some pacing elements that lean it a little more towards an RTS. And it's kind of a weird place and a very difficult place, I think, for mainstream gaming journalists who, quite frankly, a lot of times just aren't super experienced in their breadth of what different types of genres that they play. And so, there might have been a reason for kind of the, chicanery type of reporting that there was around what this game was, but there it is. And so now the game's out. There's still this expectation and still sometimes this impression that this is a pirate game, and it really isn't. And so there's not a ton of parallels besides historical setting and window drapes and backdrop around the notion of pirates. I think it in some ways leans a little bit more towards kind of Sid Meier's Pirates in some ways, except you don't have those elements of gameplay where Sid Meier's Pirates had sword play and things like that. But at any rate, it's as is always the case with Ubisoft, as I've been commenting a couple times a month for the last 6 to 8 months since I really kind of picked up on this and started paying attention to it. Ubisoft games have this weird way of performing unexpectedly, catching people by surprise, gaining way more traction than you anticipate, and that's further reinforced by Ubisoft's own commitment to a game. And so a thing to keep an eye on is, look, you see what Ubisoft is reporting now, and if Ubisoft is reporting that this game is gaining traction and more than they thought it would, then they're going to support it because that's what Ubisoft does. I don't know why, but they made the decision and choice that they made with Rainbow Six. It still bothers me to this day. They diluted and watered down a lot of what historically we had thought Rainbow Six was when they made Siege, and they experienced a lot of backlash, and it didn't gain a ton of traction, but Ubisoft stuck with it. They kept pumping money into it. They kept putting development resources behind it, and that thing is one of the best cash earning investments, right? Sailing and navigating these very difficult and challenging waters of the gaming industry. They put a lot of effort behind and delivered content to the community for The Crew 2, the community for Riders Republic, which no one even talks about or even remembers, but yet that is a game that still gets content. I am sure that Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora will as well. They obviously, support Far Cry, and so it'll be interesting to see how this goes. I was a big Dreadnought player, which is I can't remember even the studio name behind that. It was like Gray, something other Gray, maybe Greyhawk Games, but it was one of those games that I would just constantly go back and play, even though I knew the player count was small. I was really fortunate that there were bots in the game, and even though it wasn't necessarily fun to fight bots, at least when you went and played it, there was you could run a game. You weren't sitting in a lobby waiting for players to populate. You could just go off, and sometimes it was just you on one team and one human on the other. But I stuck with it because I really enjoy capital ship combat games. It'll be very interesting to see if this thing gains traction and holds. I'm pretty sure it was mixed reviews on Steam when I went and looked at it. But it is very possible that this will become the type of game, again, that like so many Ubisoft games where it launches to deadpan kind of reception, both on console and on PC. And then when you go back 12 months later and look at it on Steam, it'll have very positive review ratings and a community that's rallied around it and really loves it because Ubisoft is supporting and providing a thing that is in their wheelhouse and in their niche when a lot of the industry isn't. So, I still have a lot of fear that this game that things are not going to go well for this game and it's eventually going to topple over. But at least there's a bright sliver of light shining through the window crack where, it may be supported and it may sail on and it may have a much longer time to live than we would have kind of thought it was given its rocky start and its rocky launch. The last thing I want to talk about is something that one of my mutuals asked me to address. So obviously, PlayStation made its announcement of the layoffs that it was having today. Jim Ryan put up a blog post on SIE, on the SIE Communications website. Hermen Hulst also put up a blog post, and Jim Ryan is again kind of the still is he still apparently wears the title of CEO. This may have been kind of one of his things that he was doing on his way out the door. It is very much, from my understanding, the thing Bobby Kotick was supposed to do with the layoffs of the people at Activision, although Bobby Kotick basically said, F that, you guys deal with it, not my problem anymore, took his golden parachute, and I'm sure is sipping Mai Tais down at Mar-a-Lago, playing golf with Trump or other people, friends of his, probably with Lulu Chang Messervy down there as well. So, Hiroshi Totoki obviously had honchoed the earnings call as the acting CEO of the PlayStation Network, and so Jim Ryan, as far as I can tell, is not in the seat, but his name was definitely ascribed to this blog post. And like I said, probably one of his final duties that he did, just because, as much as possible, you would think and reason that most businesses and corporations don't want to saddle the new person with a big major layoff that they're going to do. Better to let that happen to the old person who isn't going to be around long enough to kind of experience, the hate and vitriol that's going to come out of that. But Hermen Hulst is the creative head of the studios and kind of is the relative equal to Matt Booty, although the description of their roles is very much not the same. Matt Booty is very much the business leadership of the publishing arm of Xbox. Hermen Hulst, I think, follows a certain similar duties, but more so is really the kind of creative lead for the studios. And he put up a blog post as well, addressed several of the things that the company wanted to convey to employees, but also to investors, and also to, I think, to a certain extent, its fans. One of the things that I've mentioned, for which I got a lot of heat for, but we're seeing that it is actually the choice that Sony chose to make, was that Jim Ryan really was the nickels and cents of the PlayStation organization, and really spoke to that. But he didn't always necessarily do the best job in messaging to the PlayStation's fans. He was very kind of ham-fisted and very kind of blunt and very matter-of-fact and very pragmatic. He also didn't resonate with the PlayStation community as a gamer and someone who is really interested in the creative aspect of video games. Hermen Hulst does. He does convey that. And so one of the things I had said is like, look, Sony, you may just want to have Hermen Hulst kind of be your front man for the PlayStation brand because he resonates a lot more with gamers than Jim Ryan does. A lot of people had a lot of negative sentiments about that and felt like they didn't need a face man. And, the thing I was trying to convey to them is, hold on, guys, pump the brakes. I didn't say put Hermen Hulst on a plane and fly him all over to every content creator podcast that was PlayStation branded and have him do Interview-a-Palooza like Phil Spencer does. What I said was, look, when you do have something that you have to message and you have to convey, let that be Hermen Hulst, because he does a better job of it and a better job of framing it than Jim Ryan does. So he made some mentions of things today in the wake of the layoffs that I think were important. But I think the things that are important about what he said are the things that the gaming community and Twitter and social media and mainstream journalism is not focusing on. They focused on the things that it's very fun to take on a fishhook and run 24 miles out into international waters and extrapolate and get on their jump to conclusions mat and make a very big hand-wavy deal about in typical reality TV fashion, then really grasping and latching onto the things that I really think are important about what the PlayStation Corporation and brand is really focusing on. So let me just grab a little more to drink, and I will get to the details on that here in a second. Okay, so in this blog post, he mentioned a few things, and I'll talk about, I think, the things that you're going to hear from everyone else. Kind of just to set the table, here are the opening statements. Today, Sony Interactive Entertainment initiated a reduction in our workforce, including within PlayStation Studios, and I wanted to talk about the impact that will have. These decisions have been extremely difficult, but are necessary, and I think it's important to be transparent. U.S.-based studios and groups impacted by a reduction in workforce are Insomniac Games, Naughty Dog, as well as our technology, creative, and support teams. In UK and European-based studios, it is proposed the PlayStation Studios' London studio will close in its entirety, and there will be reductions in Guerrilla and Firesprite. Now, 2 data points here. As far as I can tell, I think London Studios is really kind of a visual effects studio. And so I think they work mostly on assets and support, not necessarily directly in building titles of their own. Firesprite, obviously, the primary studio who collaborated and worked with Guerrilla to put out Horizon. I can't remember the name of the title right now, but the VR version of the Horizon franchise, for which they actually received an award at the DICE Award. So again, very, very tragic and very ironic, in a very sad way, that here's a team that was just on stage to accept an award at DICE, an award that they were given by their peers and other creatives in recognition for their creative works and how it was delivered. And now, there's a chunk of them that are being laid off. These are in addition to some smaller reductions in other teams across PlayStation Studios. And so the major thing that I think where 5 is in its 4th year, and we are at a stage where we need to step back and look at what our business needs. At the same time, our industry has experienced continuing and fundamental change, which affects how we all create and play games. Delivering the immersive narrative-driven stories that PlayStation Studios is known for at the quality bar that we aspire to requires a reevaluation of how we operate. Delivering and sustaining social online experiences, allowing PlayStation gamers to explore our worlds in different ways, as well as launching games on additional devices, such as PC and mobile, requires a different approach and different resources. To take on these challenges, PlayStation Studios has to grow. We have brought brilliant and successful studios into our family. We've invested in new technology and partnerships. We've recruited talent from across our industry and beyond. So I'm going to hold up there. That is the part that people latched onto and were the main talking points of today. The main things that people latched onto was about PlayStation 5 being in its fourth year. There was very much of a hullabaloo made about a similar statement about PlayStation 5 being halfway through its life cycle, as if that was a negative. No, the point is that the console is in its fourth year, and given that the console is going to have a 7 to 8 year life cycle as the preeminent console on the market for the PlayStation brand, the same as it's going to be for Xbox, that means that these consoles are hitting the back half of their life cycle. Again, there's nothing controversial or no gotcha moment to be had in that. It's simply a mathematical statement. Then these notions that we need to step back and look at what our business needs. This notion of experiencing fundamental change, and this mention of launching games on additional devices and requiring a different approach and different resources. So the voice track that went around about this was greater corroboration of this whole notion that people have wildly extrapolated, in my opinion, that, oh my God, PlayStation is going day and date and putting its games on PC right away. They're also going to start putting their games on everything. Else they're going to do the same thing that Xbox is doing and, put their games on every screen, and every screen is going to be a PlayStation, like Sarah Bond is saying that every screen is an Xbox, and eventually you're going to be able to play Uncharted on your baby monitor, right? This is not what has been said. And so two of the things that I think are going wrong in the gaming conversation is there are things that are said, and then there are things that are interpreted. And what I see happening in writing, as people converse about these things on social media, is I see people doing a wild crosswalk from a thing that was said to their interpretation, and then the articulation comes across as an assertion that the thing that they interpreted as being said was the thing that was said. And I'm like, no, time out. That's not what he said. That's how you interpret what he said. And your interpretation is something that is done through a filter that is your own bias. And that's not a statement of any deliberate contrivance or narrative, although sometimes I think often it is. That's just a simple fact of the matter of that. When I hear something, I interpret it through my personal filter. When another person hears it, they interpret it through their personal filter. And very often, we both hear different things. I think also a lot of what's going on is that I and several others are having conversations with people who are, say, not married and not in long-term relationships and haven't had that experience of when another human being who has a say in your life, right, says something, and you repeat back to them what you heard, and they just don't have the normative experience on a daily basis of being taken to the mat because the thing you repeat back is not what that person said. And until you hit the point in that relationship where you start catching a clue and figuring it out and learn to listen to the person and repeat back to them what they actually said, right, you're going to wind up having a very difficult life. And I think a lot of the people that I'm talking to don't have that experience, and so they're in this level of maturity where they're accustomed to hearing things and repeating back what they heard, not what the person said. And so, again, what people took from this statement is what they heard. My personal thing that I took away from this blog post was much more so this middle statement that I have up on the screen, which is that Hermen Hulst's priority is still delivering immersive, narrative-driven stories that PlayStation Studios are known for at the quality bar that they aspire to. Now, getting there requires a reevaluation of how we operate. And one of the filters that I'm processing that through, and one of the things that's going on, I think, in the discussion today, and that's not understood, is that over the 50-year history of the industry, most of which I've been reporting or researching on, more so than I haven't, and not just this industry, but others, there are evolutionary times, right? When you look at the industrial history of a market, and I'm talking things at the macro level, not year-to-year business cycle stuff. I'm talking about doing long-term study of an industry over half a century. There have been points and inflection points in the history where there has been a reset and there has been a recalibration of the way that industry does business. And so in the gaming industry, first of all, we saw one of those in a major way in 1983 when we had the video game market crash. But another one that happened, and one that isn't as highly touted, is we also saw a lot of this as we transitioned from console generation 6 to console generation 7. And so on the PlayStation side, when you had the rise of Kaz and his takeover of the PlayStation Studios and then eventually the entire Sony corporation, there were also massive layoffs that were going on around the industry, and they weren't quite at the numbers that we have now. But again, part of that was invoked by the pandemic. But you also had periods where corporations were doing layoffs of 10,000, layoffs in the single-digit thousands, right, in gaming corporations and gaming divisions and gaming studios. And so you had a major reset. A lot of what's not part of the conversation now, too, is how people have forgotten how in the PlayStation 3 era, Sony shuttered a lot of studios. And they shuttered those studios when, regardless of how critically acclaimed the games were that those studios produced, they didn't reach the commercial success that PlayStation needed. And so the unfortunate reality is that, lots of money gets spent by corporations teaching lean production and lean manufacturing and lean software development. We have this whole notion of the discipline of Six Sigma. And part of what corporations do is you go through this cycle of everybody lives high on the hog. There's overhiring. There's bad discipline in managing overhead costs. And so I've mentioned a couple of times on the podcast, and I've lived through this, is that, part of what Totoki said, I think I talked about this a little bit on Brap's rant, part of what Totoki said is that people need to tighten up belts. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean the extrapolation that people are making, which is that, oh my God, AAA game development is unsustainable, and, we've got to do all these crazy things. Again, it could mean something very simple as fringe benefits that studios enjoy. I mean, if you've ever looked at a gaming studio and you look at in the entire way a gaming studio is put together, most gaming studios, the ones that you see pretty pictures of, right, in magazines, how they're not built in any way like standard corporate America, where everybody's in a cubicle that looks exactly the same, right? They've got foosball tables and pool tables and catered lunches and food that, like, and again, I'm not saying every studio is like that, but I'm like, that is the type of undisciplined cost expenditure that are the types of things that get targeted when C-suite people say we need to tighten our belts. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that that the entire business needs to do this conversion. I've talked about several questions that have to be asked when people say, hey, they're going to start putting their games everywhere. And I say, okay, in order to do that, it requires an increase in the level of effort and an increase in the number of engineering labor hours that are spent. So please explain to me how, because notionally the console market is capped, explain to me how I spend more money, which negatively impacts my operating margin, which is what Totoki said he wants to do a better job on. Explain to me how that gets me to a point of greater profitability, right? And again, because the point of it can't be, I just want to earn more revenue. The point of it needs to be, I'm going to somehow expend less, earn more, and also not cannibalize or negatively impact my other businesses. When you're Apple and you make the decision that you're going to eat your iPod business, you do that because you see a future in where the iPhone is a convergence device for which you can charge a lot more money and have a lot better margins, and you can outrun the pace of change in technology and reposition yourself in a better place. Unless you can put that type of argument together for PlayStation putting their games on every screen, you don't really have an argument that tells me that you're going to violate the first principle of business, which is that you do not abandon or orphan the customers that you already have in the effort to chase customers that you never know are going to arrive. You always protect your business base. And again, I mentioned this on Brap's Brap's rant. If you're in the technology industry and you really study these matters and you're really embedded in in maneuvering around these matters all the time, you were very familiar with a book called The Innovator's Dilemma, and that is a lot of what you're seeing now. It's figuring out how to not be eaten by the thing that you can't see, by the innovation that's coming behind you. It's about how to always try and figure out how to be skating ahead, but at the same token, defending the business base that you have now and not leaving scorched earth behind you as you try and get there. And so, like I said, what I took away from this blog post was less about this is some extinction level event and we got to change radically the entire business. It's this is the thing that we're known for. This is the thing we need to make sure that we protect and defend, because this is the thing that is representative of the brand. And so this is what we need to maintain. We need to go about doing that a different way. But he's not saying that they need to do a different thing. He's saying they need to do the same thing that they are known for. And the key thing is that we need to do it at the quality bar we aspire to. Because one of the things that I think that is my takeaway from looking and studying the PlayStation business is that no matter what they do, they always want to try and maintain that quality bar for which they're known. They're not always successful at it. They do have misses. They do have problems, just like every studio does. I think they try and keep that periodicity, that frequency of those misses very small. The other thing that I think was a major takeaway for me from listening to this and reading this is this next statement here. But growth itself is not an ambition. That is a incredibly poignant way of putting it. And in a lot of businesses, in my current company that I'm in, one of our big things is that we don't want to just go after every type of work and every type of avenue and every morsel we see on the market, unless it is well within the lane of our core competencies and we want to experience growth, but we want to grow intelligently and smartly. A lot of companies will make an effort to grow by just going after everything. And what they do is they don't maintain tight focus. They don't focus on doing all of those things well. They gain revenue streams, but they don't necessarily gain profitability, and they often find themselves in situations that are untenable. So again, what Hull says here is, but growth itself is not an ambition. PlayStation Studios is committed to continually discovering ways to work together, collaborating and combining our efforts to ensure that we are able to craft games that push the boundaries of play and deliver what you expect from us. Now, one of the things that I've been saying since I have, been having a commentary on what I think, Xbox needs to do better for the last couple of years, since, in my opinion, things really started kind of turning south from a messaging and a PR perspective. But it also, to me, sounds like what I'm hearing here, which is that because he talks about discovering ways to work together and collaborating and combining our efforts. And again, it dovetails into something like Totoki said, where he said we need to tighten our belts and we need to do better about operational efficiency. One of the things I don't understand with these companies, and both Xbox and PlayStation are at sizes now that have not been their historic norm. PlayStation with 21 or 23 studios, Xbox with 33 or 36 studios. I can't remember the exact number. They have also done this during periods of significantly onboarding additional studios. You go to the PlayStation blog, there are something like 6 or 7, I think, blog posts about welcome to this new studio, welcome to that new studio. As that type of growth and expansion continues, one of the things I do not understand is this constant voice track that I hear that tells me that there's not enough of a shared services concept. I don't understand why every studio has its own IT department. I don't understand why every studio has its own IT resources. I don't understand why every studio has its own test organization. I don't understand why every single one has their own set of tools and utilities and things that are common. One of the things that you do in a large technology organization is you figure out where there's commonality, you figure out where you are experiencing and suffering and hemorrhaging from the same cost being expended in multiple places, and you start asking, how can we do that more efficiently? Why doesn't everybody doing cloud native development in a common environment? Why doesn't everybody have the exact same agile release train? Why doesn't everybody have the same CI/CD pipeline? Why don't I employ 10 people who can do Jenkins jobs to do automated overnight builds instead of 100 people who are all doing the same thing? Why are some of them why are some people writing their scripts in Ansible while some other people are off doing things in PowerShell? Like, these are the type of things that you do when you try and gain operational efficiencies and tighten people up. and stop some of the bleeding and the hemorrhaging, doing redundant activities in different ways, constantly reinventing the wheel. That is the type of thing that I hear when I see this passage, is that one of the things they're going to do and look at in order to gain operational efficiency is they're going to look at exactly what they say here: new ways to work together, collaborating and combining our efforts. One of the things that I have commented on several times throughout the years is how Ubisoft has broken the code on this years before. And again, Ubisoft isn't necessarily the shining example of fiscal responsibility or the most successful at what it does. But one of the things that it did years and years and years ago, and it's one of the reasons why, again, as you see with lots of publishers now, you go and you see an Ubisoft game and you see, and again, people point this out as a reason why Skull and Bones isn't good, but it's also a reason why lots of other Ubisoft games are good, or at least are implemented well. And that's when you see the credits of who works on an Ubisoft game, and you see like 6, 8, 10, 12 Ubisoft studios listed. One of the reasons is because years and years and years ago, I want to say like in the early 2008, like 2008 timeframe, 2007 was the first time I started hearing about this. And before it was a norm across the industry, they had developed ways, processes, and tools whereby if a developer was sitting down and I can't remember what the name of it is, geez Louise, I can't remember the guys who used to do the Rainbow Six series down in North Carolina. If there was a developer sitting down there who didn't have enough cycles, who wasn't heavily loaded, and really only had 24 hours of work in a 40-hour work week, there were processes and tools and tracking to make other project managers, other creative directors, other resource management and resource planning people aware that developer only had 16 hours, and that therefore maybe that developer could do 16 hours of work on the next Assassin's Creed game and work remotely and collaborate with Ubisoft Montreal, right? And so before that was kind of the norm, and then basically every studio had to figure out how to do this during the pandemic, but that was a norm at Ubisoft, and people were able to work on projects, and there was a lot more efficient use, I think, of resources and manpower. Now, again, Ubisoft has its own problems, and it has its own groupthink, and it has its own weird way of doing governance that kind of results in every game coming out of that publishing arm to be kind of the same, or to hit on the same kind of key themes and elements, which is, again, why you get a lot of kind of nickelbacking of Ubisoft games, as far as them all being kind of the same. But, regardless, hey, Glacian 3, thanks for coming through. I appreciate you. Sorry for, sorry I haven't been paying as much. I wouldn't have been paying as much attention to the chat as I was kind of here entering the last messages of the podcast. But thanks so much for coming through. I do appreciate you. But that's the type of thing that I see and hear is more of a thing that PlayStation is going to do. Ian Holtz here talks about, we looked at our studios and our portfolio, evaluating projects in various stages of development, and we've decided that some of those projects will not move forward. Again, tightening of the belt. And this is a matter of, you can't bet on every horse. You need to bet on the horses that you think are going to win. And so again, at the end of the day, this is really about, a sadness and a heaviness of heart that should be associated with the employees at PlayStation Studios, but not just PlayStation Studios, around the industry, that are finding adversity and in some cases not being treated well by their corporations who overhired and didn't really have a plan for what to do if that overhiring was a mistake. Again, there are people are finding indicators that they don't believe that was the case at Sony. But what I would say is, regardless of whether or not they overhired, the fact of the matter is that the entire industry is going through a market correction at this point after years where things were good. And what happens when things are good is there's less of a tendency to challenge, there's less of a tendency to nitpick, there's less of a tendency to As I keep pointing back to DICE, one of the developers came up on stage and specifically mentioned how he was appreciative of people responsible for governance of PlayStation's project management framework. And mentioned that he was very happy that the team was constantly getting extensions because they were often late. And what I hear in this time and age is, okay, guys, things are different, right? The next time around, the next project, don't expect to get extensions. Don't expect there to be relief when there's an expectation that for X thousands of hours of engineering labor effort, you're expected to be X percentage complete with the project, and to be at this point on schedule, right? I expect there to be a little more regimen and a little more discipline in letting people slide like that, and again a tightening of the belt and more of a focus on metrics that say, hey, if a project is has expended more labor hours than they were expected to on our glide slope and our burn charts, and they are certain percentages behind, then we're going to take corrective action, right? There's going to be a requirement to return to green. And maybe some of those things will hit metrics where there are also thresholds that are established where, Sony governance and Sony oversight says, yeah, we're not going forward with this, right? You've expended too much, you've invested too much. And at this point, we can't see the juice being worth the squeeze. And again, just as I kind of mentioned, right, you're probably going to see something similar at Warner Brothers with regard to Suicide Squad. I mean, the unfortunate thing is, I would definitely be on standby in an expectation that we're going to hear about layoffs from Warner Brothers, specifically around Rocksteady, and that, as that studio kind of needs to do a reset and how they go forward. If Warner Brothers feels that for the labor effort that they're going to expend on making expandable content for Suicide Squad, that they're not going to see the revenue return. They also may not just be willing to bear the size of its current staff when they've staffed up and ramped to support that type of effort if Warner Brothers isn't going to allow it to go through. So that's all I have for tonight. So thanks a lot for joining in and listening. I hope that something I said in here, whether it was about security or some of the breadcrumbs that I see in the action plan around Battlefield, or around what your expectations should be for Rocksteady, or the bit that I covered about where PlayStation is, or things of that nature. Again, just to go back to the PlayStation thing, because there are lots of people who are very passionate who have wanted to argue with me very vehemently. My point about the conversation about PlayStation and what Totoki said and what's going on, in these layoffs and how the PlayStation strategy is juxtaposed to the Xbox strategy, I don't have any problem with the fact that people have their hypotheses. Totally fine for you to have an opinion and to project and theorize and speculate what you think is going to happen and what you think that was said. Where I am going to tackle somebody at the shoestrings, or where I am going to point out a problem and I am going to poke my thumb in somebody's eye, is when they assert that absolutely, unquestionably, this is what they said and this is what's going to happen, and there's no room for that. No room for any other interpretation other than mine. I'm the one person who gets it, or me and my band of merry thieves. We're the ones who get it, and everybody else is wrong. And if you guys have a different opinion, then you're the ones who are console warring, and you're the ones who have a narrative. Again, that's just a very immature way to approach discourse and a debate and the Socratic method in an exchange of ideas. I'm not tolerant of it, and I'm not going to listen to it. I'm not going to entertain it beyond more than one or two exchanges. My point is that these things are super complex. They involve an incredible number of variables, both on a technical and a financial perspective. They tread on the decisions that are made by people who are responsible for P&L, and I don't understand. If you don't know what the term P&L means, then I struggle to understand you being surprised, much less offended, by me asking you questions. By you saying, hey, I'm absolutely certain this is going to happen, and I say, okay, please explain to me these 7 questions, right? I have reasons why I'm uncertain about what you're saying, and I'm asking you to entertain me, right, by talking me through these 7 bullet points of how this would work. And 90% of the time that I ask those questions, what I get back is assertion, not built around any description or articulation of how things work. You know, porting games to other platforms is easy and is low cost. What the hell does that even mean, right? And how would a team be structured? What are the types of adversities that they go through? How do you even assert that when you don't even know how the agile process works, or what a daily stand-up on a software development team looks like, or where they post their workflow, or how an estimate is put together? Like, again, those are things like when you don't understand the day in the life of a developer, that I don't understand how you assert that something is easy or push button or isn't a problem. Just the same way that I don't understand the way Xbox ran around and said, hey, we're going to put Call of Duty on the Nintendo Switch and in the cloud, at a point where they had never talked to a developer who puts their hands on a keyboard to actually understand how hard or easy that is, or what complexity that involves, or what impediments they might encounter. So my point of it is that gaming discourse, gaming debate is that it is a conversation and it is a discussion. I'm not intolerant of other people's ideas. I'm intolerant of other people's intolerance. So for that reason, we have discussions on BRAP. We have discussions on Enough to Keep Going. I hold discussions here at Talking About Games. And if anybody wants to join in with those, they are welcome to participate. Where I'll ask you to stop participating, or I'll just ask you to keep away from me, is when your assertion is that there is no discussion and you're the gatekeeper and the gate guard of all information and opinions, and the world operates as you see it. That's just something I don't have a lot of tolerance or patience or time for. So thanks a lot for swinging by. I apologize I went long on that lecture, but hopefully you guys will keep coming back. My intention is to try and do this on Tuesday nights from now on. I'm hoping that I get on earlier, hoping that it'll be closer to 7:30, sometime between 7:30 and 9:30. 10 o'clock is really too late. But I'm hoping, like I said, I'm going through some setup and configuration here around the studio to try and make things a little easier and make sure that I have things kind of on ready standby and can put these things together. I've also kind of gone around to this paradigm where I'm scripting the show starting on Friday. So really between Friday and Sunday is when I plan to have a script put together. And then that'll give me some time to just pick onesie twosies of things that come across my windshield, or big news stories that drop on Monday and Tuesday. So we will see how that goes. For anybody who happened to swing through the chat in the live stream, I appreciate you. Glacian 3, I appreciate you coming through. For anybody who happens to watch the archive version of this episode of Talking About Games on the Rounding Off Infinity gaming channel on YouTube, I appreciate you as well. Please feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can just receive a notification whenever I post new content. Again, I will be back next Tuesday with another episode of Talking About Games. I will not be on the Basement Radio Arcade podcast. I'm going to take a break. I will be on Damage Per Second on Forte and Slow Mo Show on Thursday night, so I look forward to seeing you guys there. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Stay safe out there. Play the games that you like. Come here to talk to me about the games that you love. Once again, I'll see you guys on DPS, and also Enough to Keep Going will be on Sunday evening at 8:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as always. Until next time, good night, good luck, and good gaming. That's going to do it for me. I'm out of here.